God damn it, how is it already? So late.
Check out so much. Part 1. Part 3. A dystopian YA revolution near its concept. But you'll love them. The chosen ones I could escape the ceremony to make the revolution test. Probably not, and revolutions have conflict. And often not great reasons, and not these not model reasons. But the US military has followed a whole government highlights 5 things that create the difference. Crossing the socio-economic alienation, fighting international. Now, the dictator's dilemma comes up so much in real revolutions because modernism creates all of it. It's socio-economic opportunity, but it also highlights its sustainability and student inequality that creates infections in society that are not new. The dictator, I think their interests are not necessarily aligned with yours. North Korea has actually opened special economic zones to help their economy, but it hasn't really done a huge amount. And if North Korea allows people to leave or foreign businesses to invest, then yeah, it helps the economy, but it also means Kim Jong-un doesn't have an iron grip on where the money is going and to whom. Lifting censorship helps with education and political participation, but it also allows dissent to spread, which is exactly what happened in Egypt before Iraq fell. Modernizing can also spark elite infighting. Others who are currently in the inner circles of power have every reason to try and stop a country liberalizing, which is often what happens with modernizers, to take control themselves because they're seeing their slice of the pie shrink. This is often the case of the military, help keep the dictator in power for so long. We've seen this thousands of times before, right?
You'd think real pizza is something I eat with how much I scarf these down, but I've actually never tasted real pizza. I just like this gummy because it has a nice shape.
That powerful factions in an oppressive regime overthrow the current one, but just take it over themselves, and offer democratic idealistic reasons, though they'll often paint it that way after the fact. We overthrew
What the fuck is...
now we'll
What the fuck do you get for
the Constitution for the next
increasing the levels for this? The range and tiles.
World that claims to be democracies. A dictator opening up also allows foreign powers to exert more influence.
You're joking, right? This is the most useless fucking skill I've ever seen.
Choosing and that threatens your power base. The only option in the end becomes repression if you want to hold on to power. Over time, you alienate people more and more, those who keep you in power and the people who want to get into the circles of power, and suddenly, bingo, it's Mormon time. The dictator's dilemma is just one way revolutions happen, but it's a fascinating example of why revolutions are just... what's the word? It's... let's take a look at these causes and find ways we can imagine revolution when... Part 2. Proximate socioeconomic instability. When we write revolutions, we tend to focus a lot on this last point, injustice. Think of the death of Rue in the Hunger Games, an innocent girl slaughtered at the hands of an oppressive regime, sparking revolutions all across Panem. Anger, justice, right? It's a black and white narrative that's easily communicated, that we as the audience can get behind, that we can feel empowered by. But the truth is, injustice tends to actually be a framework that gets attached to pre-existing socio-economic instability, giving it momentum, a shared vision, and an easy message for a lot of people to get behind. After all, injustice happens all the time in autocratic societies. People are beaten and murdered and disappear off the face of the earth, and we don't see rebellion at every turn of this, especially the more and more that injustice becomes normal, everyday, accepted. Like the 2011 Egyptian revolution saw the fall of Hosni Mubarak after 3 decades of power, and though the narrative was a lot about police brutality and rights, the long-term causes were really about economic instability, income, stagnant wages, huge debt, youth unemployment, which made daily life impossible. What matters more are those first 4 factors, and then the injustice that comes out of them. And this is, by the way, not just in individuals having inconsistent access to basic needs and opportunity, but typically when communities are deprived of it, or feeling exploited more and more as time marches on, in regions, sectors of the economy, age groups, ethnic groups, and so on. And this is also the fiscal and social instability of the elites and the powerful, not that they're like starving in the streets, but that they can't collect rent or taxes, or suddenly other socially mobile groups are way more influential than them, or they feel that their wealth and power isn't protected and they can't be guaranteed it could be taken away from them at any moment, either by the dictator or the population. You've got to when large groups of young people are unable to get a job, there's that shared narrative because you, yes, you, tanks the economy. Or if your local community, your region is particularly affected and you organize around that. But, of course, lots of things cause instability. War, disease, shifts in power, new injustices. The question is whether that anger can be directed away from the system. So, World War I introduced a ton of instability to European societies, and in Russia, that anger ended up directed at the Tsar and the aristocracy, and it did lead to revolution in 1917. While Britain, there was some instability that led to people demanding rights to vote, a true shift in power, but it also saw a huge rise in nationalistic fervor. While in Russia everyone's like, we're in this stupid war because of the Tsar, everyone in Britain's like, we're in this war because of... Why are we in this war? Well, it's not the government. Brian McClellan's Promise of Blood highlights how militaries choosing not to fight for the state or turning on the state is pretty essential to a lot of revolutions and coups, because militaries are nothing if not well-organized machines and communities. And if they, as a community, can be mobilized or demobilized, then the foundations of the regime's power can be undone. But let's focus on the first part of this cause, proximate socioeconomic instability. Because the reality is, people don't necessarily respond to instability that they don't experience or they don't feel is kind of part of their community, their world. And this can be because it affects a different part of the country, or a different class to you, or a different kind of people, different ethnic group to you. Instead, it becomes, these euphemistic descriptions of regional agricultural problems when they're starving to death, or violent thugs terrorizing the streets after they've just been massacred by the police recently. Or they're de-radicalizing terrorists when they're putting children into concentration camps to eradicate their culture. The thing is, all autocratic systems still need to make the factions keeping them in power happy, be it the nobles, the military, the rich, the church, and even to some extent the working population. You've got to have someone working for you. Some regions or factions might be insulated because of this from certain kinds of instability to keep them more loyal to the government. If you can make sure that the people producing your oil are happy and you can sell that oil to other countries, well, you'll be perfectly fine for the most part. And it's going to lead to really interesting world-building quirks, where Thailand and Turkey have a flawed democracy where the
Why are you talking about real life
the outcome that done that
as if it's fucking big?
even these
Ah yes, the world building in Thailand sure is quirky.
Hunky adapts this to its world building too. So the capital gives special privileges to districts 1 and 2, even though they're subordinate, even though they still have to participate in the games, because it creates a buffer zone between them and the other districts, and because this is where a lot of their military is drawn from. It's what keeps them in power. So you can see this connection between how the state insulates certain groups of people from socioeconomic instability and injustice, and how they keep themselves in power. You take that away, and you get what we saw in 1984 in the Philippines. Dictator Ferdinand Marcos sent a tank battalion to crush a supposed revolt. But when they were met with nuns kneeling, rosaries, and children offering the soldiers food and water, the soldiers refused to fight. Over 80% of the military defected, and this immediately led to the fall of Marcos's regime. So, one way you can think of revolutions is not just in terms of injustice
Nice.
or ideology, but
I remember that in history class.
instability that
No, I don't. We never discussed it. What the fuck?
communities have with those in power and the foundations of that power. Figuring out how that is eroded.
Why the fuck are we not talking about Marcos other than as a fucking footnote?
Regime as it is, and what kind of instability, injustice, or circumstances could change that, right? Inconsistent pension payments, being repeatedly overlooked for cabinet positions, being forced to kill peaceful protesters. One thing to note is that instability does not necessarily mean everyone's getting poorer or
Nice,
worse.
yes.
It does, but income
Give it to me.
inequality is one of those things we mentioned. Dictators
What the
that there's a whole group of people getting way better off, and a whole lot of people that aren't.
He's tried into killing a boss.
Life, the way things have been,
That's crazy.
being really disrupted, and you don't feel safe and secure. And this is both at the elite level and the poorest level. Like, the Industrial Revolution saw huge economic growth all across Europe and the emergence of a class of wealthier people. But that rapid shift also introduced
Where the fuck is Clear Strike? I don't have Clear Strike yet, yikes.
And forced migration and saw the intensification of colonial oppression across the world. Instability is just as much about the sense of your life being in flux and a feeling of change outside of your control. And this period was also fertile ground for revolutionary sentiment, challenging existing power structures the way things have worked. It led to the Age of Revolution. America, France, Serbia, Spain, Italy, Greece, Belgium, Haiti, the Netherlands, Poland, all across Latin America, exploding in revolution. And then, again, in 1848, as one, this wealthier class demanded more concessions, more rights, more power as they ruled this instability, and two, working conditions for the poor got even worse. You know, the children meant to be yearning for the mines and whatever, but work was unstable, and that sentiment
Yearning for the mines! No!
uneven economic development.
God, this video was made before the Minecraft trailer. God damn it.
Hallmark of the emerging flintlock fantasy genre, which centers a lot on pollution, like that Django Wexler's The Thousand Names, you know. It looks at the economic disparity that emerges in response
it's
to
you.
these revolutionary
You've made a wise
technologies.
choice.
And also, I think it's really interesting that that's coming out now.
Is there
in
anything?
modern
Guess
day,
I'm
when
on the
income
job.
Quality and so on is a
Welcome
huge
to the
element
Rooster Inn.
of the political discussions
Sign in
that
over
we
here,
have.
please.
You're seeing those same sentiments coming out in the fiction that we discuss and write. So if you want to incorporate
Fuck, I need 3
into
more
your
levels
world,
before I can get Clear Strike
there's
again.
commentary.
Come back here
Communities
whenever
with
you're
new
tired.
wealth can motivate political change because they feel the old system doesn't really serve them. And that is what happens when a dictator tries to modernize. So you're looking at both people being better off, worse off, and the contrast between them. This is also something we see in cyberpunk stories now, which again are seeing a resurgence, where the uber-rich want to overthrow democracy, and the poor want to overthrow them. Part 3. Injustice. Just like anger for socioeconomic instability can be directed outwards, away from the regime, so can justice, including back at the victims themselves. You've seen this 1,000 times before, were they innocent protesters being shot, or were they radical rebels inciting violence in our streets?
Our enemies seeking to divide us
Uyghur Muslims are famously in detention camps in China right now to supposedly combat, quote, religious extremism. A narrative that a lot of people in China buy into because of how the state has framed this injustice. And they've done similar things to Tibetan culture in the past as well. Ethnic, religious, regional lines can be powerful narratives to justify repression and sources of community instability and injustice that in turn motivate revolt. Children of Men has one of the most horrific and grounded depictions of this kind of instability, and though it frames it more as societal collapse than revolution, it could easily turn out that way. Of course, one thing that is often ignored in fiction is that revolutions introduce instability and injustice to a region. Like, studies have shown that if rebels are the ones who are bombing your area, causing gunfire fights in the streets, you probably think that they're the source of the instability, and you're more likely to side with the regime. Killing a few uppity protesters here and there isn't the worst injustice compared to your neighbor getting shot and mauled to death 3 weeks ago, especially because revolutions are going to target logistical centers, government buildings, bridges, railways, all of which are manned and used by everyday civilians. Makes their life hell as well. So when we're building, people might turn against the revolutionary cause if they feel like their lives are being torn apart for no good reason by them, even if the cause is a good one. So, in that way, it is about controlling the narrative. Who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed? One detail I really like in Legend of Korra is how Tarlok cracks down on non-benders in the face of this equalist revolution, aiming to supposedly remove benders entirely. Non-benders weren't necessarily behind Amon at this point, they kind of viewed him as the source of instability, the one who was causing these terrorist attacks. Until this happened, until these policies came into force, in which case their indignation turned against Tarlok, a bending government regime councilman, and benders more broadly, empowering the equalists and leading to a big revolution. It's pretty compelling to feel that people are always gonna fight for what's right. But the reality is, people can become the targets of revolutions without necessarily doing much wrong. And that can change how it's viewed, how the story of the revolution is told, how the events are recounted around the country. So this is a second way you can world-build revolutions, as a chain or perception of injustices. Who would different factions realistically blame for what is going on, especially during the lead-up to revolution? Who would buy into which narratives, who would spread which narratives, and how does injustice intersect with a community's pre-existing instabilities and problems? Part 4. Alienation. Being alienated from a national community's institutions, the legal, social, cultural, political, is a really powerful motivator because suddenly you feel outside the system, you don't feel part of it, you don't think you should respect it, you think you should change it. And this is again for the privileged and the underprivileged, and we've seen the latter do this like dozens of times, right? 1954 for Vietnam and the French, Algeria did the same in 1962, 1949 saw Indonesia free itself of Dutch rule, Zimbabwe in 1979 from British rule, colonial powers alienated the people they were governing and actively repressed them. Alienation is why so many revolutions or partition movements have been down religious or ethnic lines, hoping to carve out a section of a country for that one group who don't feel part of the system, rebelling against the government in doing so, like the 1959 Tibetan uprising against China. But it's also down class and cultural lines within a country, like the many communist revolutions of the 20th century are the best examples, right? But groups in your world might be defined by other things, by the type of magic they use, by their role in history, all sorts. The point is, you're still looking for how communities of people are alienated from the centers of power. In all of these cases, a regional, dialectal, ethnic, religious community is being either erased or severely disadvantaged or excluded from the system, cut out of it so that their problems can't be fixed within it, and so revolution becomes the answer. So again, you're wanting to look for what problems are they needing solved that aren't being addressed and will never be addressed. The OPA in James S. A. Corey's The Expanse takes this and runs with it. The Belters live out on the asteroid belt in this kind of semi-nomadic life, but I mean they've felt ignored and exploited by Mars and Earth for resources, and turn to revolution because they have been cut out of the systems of power. They're seen as pawns. Their identity is not accommodated for, and much of the series is dedicated to them trying to find recourse inside the system, and when that doesn't work, then secession is the only answer. But this also means that if the regime can convince people that there will be recourse inside the system, then they won't feel alienated, not as much. Instead, there might be some paper-thin concessions. And you'll often see that there's a history of concessions being given or deals being made and then broken and then redone, and eventually people lose faith. A big part of growing alienation is also demographic change, rapidly growing ethnic groups, or a huge generational group of young people, appearing elsewise. These all create a sense of instability and a need for change, alienated by an older system that wasn't necessarily built for them. But critically, it is just as important, if not more so, to figure out when the privileged factions within society feel alienated or unjustly excluded, pour them from the circles of power. They are the ones with the money and the power to kickstart something. They're equally just as often a squabble between the elites for not getting what they want. Like we saw this in Russia just a few weeks ago. The Wagner Group, a private military organization that fights for Russia, led by a dude called Prigozhin, attempted what was basically a coup against Putin and the higher defense ministry officials. But they framed it, as a march for justice, when it was really just a power struggle between the Russian elite circles, because Prigozhin kind of hated the defense minister Shoigu and wanted someone else in power. He's been criticizing him for months. He thinks he does it better than all of the Russian military officials. Prigozhin is not a good guy, but people seemed to welcome him because of the framing that they gave it. Robert's Rebellion in George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire is that mythic revolution where the noble lords overthrew the mad king who was burning people alive. There's the injustice. But it also turned on alienation. So Tywin Lannister betrayed the Mad King at the last moment, rising up in revolution with Robert, partly because he knew he had to do this if he wanted to stay within the circles of Robert's new regime. But he actually already felt alienated from the circles of the Mad King's power after serving loyally for years and being spited for it. Tywin Lannister was opportunistic here, because the Mad King took Jaime, his one heir, and made him a Kingsguard, so he couldn't have a kid. This elite infighting is, in one way, kind of what brought the Mad King down. And alienation, by the way, doesn't need to be active repression, it doesn't need to be police brutality in the streets, beating people down and shooting them, and executions in public. It can be cultural exclusion, the sense that a country tells a group of people, an ethnic group or a religious group, you are not who we are, and so we don't accommodate for you inside the system. Or there might be a region that's been left behind economically that the government just doesn't care for. That can be a really powerful feeling of alienation, that your problems just aren't being addressed, and that can turn into more revolutionary sentiment. There's often this huge divide in the lead up to revolution over working to change the system from within versus changing the system with revolution. What pushes one group in your society or the other into the ladder? It's radical, right? That alienation has to be stark enough. So this is a third way to think about revolution. How underprivileged communities are progressively, passively or actively alienated or repressed by the regime, and how privileged communities feel alienated from the levers of power and seek to change that by force. How would these two feelings collide? Because you gotta often have them at the same time. That's where this revolution sparks, right? One of them's the matchbox and one of them's the matchstick. Part 5. Community and elite infighting. We've talked a little bit about this in alienation, but elite infighting matters because of organizational capacity. The reason revolutions spring up around communities is that communities can be organized. Unions, churches, the military, local governments, all of these have pre-existing structures that make it easier to organize resources and movements and troops and ideas. And elites are the people in power who have connections and organizational capacity and wealth and influence to mobilize these communities. Hell, Lenin was upper middle class. Half the students who rebel in Les Mis are from noble families. They've got time to be idealistic. That growing middle class gives people to do more than suffer down in the mines for pennies every day. Figure out what gives revolution its organizational capacity, because it can't just spring out of nowhere. And how do the interests of these different groups connect? Because they might not have the same priorities, just the same endgame. The regime must fall. Margaret Atwood's books, The Handmaid's Tale and The Testaments, have revolution kind of as an afterthought. They're in the background. But one of the most interesting parts of these books is they have these kind of like epilogue chapters where there's a professor giving like a lecture on Gilead history, speculating about how it fell and the politics of it, and kind of a sociological commentary, really. And it's actually a really insightful read for world-building autocratic societies, how they both maintain themselves when they're around, how unstable they really are, and how they eventually collapse, how that all of that, of course, is inevitably going to happen. She focuses, though, on purges within the system, within the higher-ups, that elite infighting. The release of this information touched off the so-called Baal Purge that thinned the ranks of the elite class, weakened the regime, and instigated a military putsch as well as a popular revolt. The civil strife and chaos that resulted enabled a campaign coordinated by the Mayday resistance and a series of successful attacks by those resentful of the massacre of the Mormons. And she returns to this idea of the purge over and over, the elites hanging each other for immorality or violating the Gilead Code. Mayday, the resistance, is actually portrayed as kinda helpless until the elites turn on each other enough, until there's enough instability in their ranks in the first place. There's even a focus on injustice here that gives the revolution a narrative, uniting them. People don't quite realize how powerful states are and how difficult revolution really is if you're just going up against a fully fledged state power. Even a dictatorship, It's why cracks within the actual regime are so important a lot of the time. We see that breakdown of social relations in Gilead over the two books, and proximate socioeconomic instability is just a constant backdrop for the story. How expensive food is, how everything's rationed out, the simple pleasure of a hot egg. The TV series, which is okay for the most part, actually explores the dictator's dilemma in Gilead as well. One commander wants Gilead to liberalize and open up to improve the economy and have fewer human rights abuses by creating a new city for people to live more freely in, a little outside their censorship. This is all in hopes of alleviating international pressure, getting international aid, and undermine the rebels that they're constantly fighting, because if they can say, hey, this is an incredibly unjust place to live in, because they can point to the city and say, hey, there's not all these injustices that you're saying. But it also creates a bid for resistance and free thought. Other factions in Gilead seize on this, though, as supposed, quote, weakness, sparking more infighting purges, foreshadowing what is to come. This is a fourth way to think about world-building revolutions, about the competing interests of the elites in ideological differences or social or economic or religious policy, and all of this brings out other instabilities, injustices, and causes alienation within the ranks, and eventually aligns some of them with revolutionary interests. Part 6. International support. Did you know the CIA had a manual on how to assassinate politicians as part of fostering rebellion? It's called The Study of Assassination, and it included how to select targets, which methods are most effective, and what the hell to do if it all goes wrong, including admitting that assassination orders should never be committed to records or paper. Of course, I asked the CIA and they've never used it, which is really good because I was worried for a second. But if they did, you could really imagine how international interference could really undermine a regime and foster chaos in the ranks, weakening the regime to other pressures. See, if you can't feed your soldiers, communicate your movements, organize strikes and uprisings, or arm them, resupply them, then having a righteous cause isn't going anywhere. logistics are way more important than any righteous cause or determination you might have. I actually quite like the new series Andor for this. Over and over, the rebellion just fails and the Empire is just basically one step ahead, and we get this real sense that putting together the organizational capacity is the bigger challenge of rebellion. The Empire, on the other hand, is just this logistical behemoth. It's no wonder that one-on-one it wins every single time. Assassinations make logistics harder by fostering infighting and oppressive systems and removing links in a chain. But the reason international support is so important to revolutions is that, much like elites, foreign powers can fund, arm, and supply people in another country, which, I mean, I haven't checked it, but I assume that always turns out well. In fact, I can't even imagine any bad consequences coming from that.
The terror group ISIS attacking a prison facility in Syria.
But you've got to wonder, right, this mind-boggling question. Why? Why spend all these resources to just give them to another country, to a revolutionary force that might not even win? Well, the US military has written about that as well, and they talk about funding insurgencies first as a tool of disruption, to isolate, destabilize, or undermine the authority or legitimacy of a hostile government by disrupting their assets, resources, military capabilities, economic warfare, right? The publication speaks of one attempt to disrupt Soviet supply and oil lines in the 50s by assisting the Romanian Peasants' Party. It failed. In fact, if you read the publication, you see that the US failed a lot, almost universally, to a darkly comedic level. But the point is they tried, and you get points for that, right? Germany didn't send Lenin back to Russia during World War I because they thought Russia deserved to give communism a shot, but because it could help Russia revolt and get them out of the war. In fact, it got them one of the most brutal treaties in Europe, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which gave them all of this land. Ah, goodness, could you imagine if Germany was made to sign like a treaty that was as bad as that for them? God, I mean, that would have some consequences, I assume. Secondly, they talk about international support as a tool of coercion, forcing a government into concessions or a change in policy. This can be to coerce access to resources or trade deal, to make them do something in the region, sometimes backing someone that they think will actually give them a better deal. It's kind of like a threat. And thirdly, international support is a tool of regime change, which again, I assume just always goes well, to create a, quote, more ideologically favourable ally. This can be mixed in with the promise of liberation, and even if partly true, historically, countries have interests as well. Trade deals, international hegemony, influence and power, basically. It's not always out of the goodness of their heart. This is a fifth way to envision world-building revolution. What do other countries want? What do their neighbours want? How would their support shape the revolution, its policies, its successes, its losses, and the world that comes after? The Iron Bank in Bravos in A Song of Ice and Fire is a great example of this kind of world building. They lend money to countries or states, and if the state doesn't pay them back, they fund revolutions against them, and they give money to people who do promise to pay it back. In A Dance with Dragons, they agreed to support Stannis for the Iron Throne, a man famous for keeping his word after Robert's rule put the crown in millions in debt that they never intend to really pay back. That's using civil war as a tool of coercion and regime change. On the other hand, in The Expanse, Mars enters into an uneasy short-term alliance with the OPA to at least undermine Earth's access to asteroid resources and give them leverage. There's disruption and coercion. On the other hand, neighbouring countries might consider opposing revolutionary efforts and supporting an even autocratic regime, no matter how bad they are or how righteous the revolution really is, because they don't want an unstable, war-torn neighbour who they need to trade with or depend on economically. Currently, Sudan is heading for a civil war between two rival elite factions. Libya has picked a side with the RSF, but mostly because of the economic and military ties they have with the RSF regime, more than any righteous reasons. It'll help Libya's own dictator stay in power as well. On the other hand, Egypt actually more naturally aligns with the SAF, but has to play pretty safe because of how economically dependent they are on the network of allies connected to the RSF. Which sides your neighbouring countries fall on is not just a moral choice. All of this is why dictators are so often reluctant to allow international influence in their countries, in their arena even, because it tends to end up with coercion, disruption, and potentially regime change. So, one answer to the dictator's dilemma is they band together in a fellowship of police brutality. They have this rational mutual survival interest. China might intervene to stop a revolution in North Korea, not because they love the way the country is currently run, but because they don't want an ideologically opposed state on their border there, while the US might fund a revolution there for geopolitical reasons in the same way that they have in the past other places. Part 7. Breaking Point. Okay, so you're a very beloved, not at all propagandized dictator of a moderately sized but poor country. You tried to modernize, and now you've got some growth, but you've also got some growing income inequality, and you've highlighted a lot of pre-existing economic instability. You've alienated your allies in the military, who now want you gone and are blaming you for all of the atrocities they helped you out with anyway. The poor feel you aren't addressing their problems, and have a right to say something now, stupid poor people, and other countries are now cutting deals with other factions for oil supplies or a shift in economic policy. What do? The way you used to solve problems in the past, which was mostly by shooting people, isn't working so much anymore. Concessions aren't enough. Punishments only spur on revolt. Resistance takes longer and longer to put down, and sometimes it doesn't get put down at all. Sending in the military is less reliable, there's less money for you to pay people off, economic measures don't stop spiraling, you stop censoring the press and the internet, but that just spreads the revolutionary ideas even more. Suddenly, you're sitting on a throne of newspaper, and a lot of people have matches in their hands. Think about how your regime has maintained order and solved problems in the past, with bribes, with the military, with spies and manipulation, or concessions. And why do those methods stop working so much anymore? Why are they working less and less? And you've got to think about, by the way, all of these causes in terms of them being structural, so long-term, and immediate. Something that actually sparks, that people respond to emotionally, that gets them involved, that gets things going. Short-term and long-term. Revolutions might happen overnight, but they ferment for years, and they have multiple causes, multiple reasons, multiple historical readings that you can look back on. It's no one definitive explanation. That's what I'm trying to get across with all of this. Great world building means your world can be explained in multiple ways. Revolutions are brewing all over the real world, and the horrors we're seeing right now in Russia and Ukraine are deeply connected to the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity in 2013, as well as the revolts funded by Russia in Donetsk and Luhansk for geopolitical reasons, which they frame wrongly as revolutions against an oppressive power, but are really about Russian expansionism. And I think it'd be really useful for you to learn more about that in real-life video on Russia and Ukraine before 2022.
Yep.
It's a fascinating look at how complex revolutions can be, and you can learn a lot for your world building. That video is available at the link down below over on Nebula. See, us creators, we are Nebula. Yep, us, this person, and a whole bunch of others. And given how I just made a video on how AI is working its way into creative spaces, I would love for you to support us as human individuals. That Russia and Ukraine video is part of a whole series called Modern Conflicts, and Nebula also comes with Nebula classes now, like Tony Sandos's one on video editing, videos just like this if you want to give YouTube a shot yourself. And you can check all those videos out by using my link for 40% off Nebula for an entire year, cheapest chips, down at the link in the description below. And using my link does help a lot because it helps me specifically. Thank you very much. It will mean a lot, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. But let's bring all of this together in a revolutionary summary. 1. Revolutions can be interpreted as a pattern and response to socio-economic instability, changing relationships between communities and those in power, eroding the foundations of their power over time, who would be more loyal to the regime, and what would shift that relationship. 2. Revolutions can be read as a pattern and response to injustice intersecting with socio-economic instabilities. Who would communities blame, especially as the revolution introduces more injustices and instability? 3. Alienation as a powerful force in revolution, be it down ethnic, religious, or other lines, or alienation from the circles of power for the elites. This can be through passive policymaking, cultural norms, or active repression. 4. Elite infighting and international support is fundamental to mobilizing and logistical management, as well as weakening the existing regime. How do these interests collide, and with what instabilities? What do neighboring countries want? 5. Identify the long-term structural causes of the revolution and the immediate, transient ones that set it off. All of these causes create an unstable equilibrium where the usual ways of dealing with social problems are no longer as effective. Stay nerdy, my friends, and you haven't got it yet? Go get on writing World Building Volume 2, because Volume 3 is coming at the end of the year. Oh, and I'll see you in the future. That's right. I have catchphrases I have to say.
Looks like the adventure continues up. You know what, yeah, I think I should fucking stop.